minutes. Okay, welcome everybody. Our guest today is David Abram. David Abram is a cultural ecologist and philosopher who lectures and teaches widely on several continents. He is the author of the books Becoming Animal and The Spell of the Sensuous, in which he gave us the wonderful term, the more than human world, which has since become widely adopted. David's work engages the ecological depths of the imagination, exploring the ways in which sensory perception, language, and wonder inform the relation between the human body and the breathing earth. He is a two-time recipient of the Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction and recently held the International Arne Næss Chair in Global Justice and Ecology at the University of Oslo. A close student of the traditional ecological knowledge of diverse indigenous peoples, David was the first contemporary philosopher to advocate for a reappraisal of animism as a complexly nuanced and uniquely viable worldview, a broad reappraisal that is now underway in many disciplines. In recent years, David's work has come to be associated with the broad movement loosely termed the New Materialism, due to his espousal of a radically transformed sense of matter and materiality. So welcome, David. I'm so pleased that you could join us this afternoon. It's very generous of you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks, Tani, for inviting me, and thanks for that introduction. So yeah, I'm David. I'm a cultural ecologist, which sort of combines anthropology and ecology, and I'm a philosopher, or what some folks are calling a geophilosopher, which I take to mean just somebody who is working out ways of thinking under the influence of the more than human earth. As an ecologist, what I am particularly known for, first and foremost, is my work on the ecology of perception, or what we might call the ecology of sensory experience, how the activity of our senses, of our eyes, our skin, our ears, functions to bind our separate nervous systems into the encompassing ecosystem. That perception acts almost like a glue, that entangles our individual nervous systems within the wider ecosystem. Or ecology that enfolds and surrounds us. I'm also fascinated with, and a lot of my work is on what we could call the ecology of language, how what we say has such a profound influence on what we see or hear or even taste of the earth around us. Because I'm convinced that there are ways of speaking that a lot of us have inherited from the curious civilization into which we were born, ways of speaking that actually frustrate or inhibit the spontaneous kinship between our animal senses and the animate earth. But I'm just as convinced that there are other ways of wielding our words that that can encourage and enhance that instinctive rapport between our sensate body and the flesh of the breathing land around us. And so it's within that terrain that all of my work dances generally. So I thought I would pluck a number of threads that I've seen turn up in the blogs. I didn't get to read the most recent blogs from the last day and a half. Just been real busy with family stuff here, and it's Hanukkah, and my daughter's home from college. But plucking some of the threads that came up earlier, pieces, and and then also go off on some tangents that may take me very far afield, but not afield from the worlds that you folks ponder, that aesthetics, which really is a word that just names the activity of our senses. Um, I thought just to mention first, really briefly, because I'm one of those who is not entirely happy or at ease with dropping out the term humanism, just because it has all sorts of worthwhile things that have been associated with it at various times. But one way of resolving the problem for me is to notice that, well, it's a simple analogy, but I just wanted to suggest that as the human is to the animal, that is, if the human is one of the animals, so humanism is to animism. If the human is one of the animals, so humanism is just one of the animisms. There's also frogism, spiderism, humpback whaleism, hummingbirdism, crowism, and that is to say, each creature, each being experiencing the world through its own rich set of senses, each being engaging, participating according to its own bodily comportment. And we too, as humans. So humanism can be taken just in that simple way as one of the animisms, in which case we might even allow that in our universities where the humanities are so under assault right now. But rather than dropping the humanities, let's just think of the humanities as one part of the animalities and have a huge department of animalities within each university. But that's only partly tongue-in-cheek. I wanted to hark back early in the discussion in the blogs. At some point, John Sakata, I think, wrote something like reason is not opposed to feeling, but reason is a particular kind of feeling, And Tanny, I think you asked him to, or others, to elaborate on that a bit. I don't know how much happened. I wanted to say it got me to thinking of straight lines and thinking of how a straight line is actually a kind of a curve. Or we could say that a straight line is a curved line that is denying its curvature. But it's also analogous to this something that's very real to me. It's a kind of gesture, and it's there in the last footnote to my first book, The Spell of the Sensuous. I promise I'm not going to read from this thing, but just this one last footnote, which I tucked, into a footnote, and then at the very end of the book, as a kind of skeleton key to the whole work. So I'm just going to read it because it's analogous to the move of seeing reason as a particular kind of feeling, or seeing a straight line as a particular kind of curvature, a curved line that's denying its curvature. I wrote, in contrast to a long-standing tendency of Western social science This work has not attempted to provide a rational explanation of animistic beliefs and practices. On the contrary, it has presented an animistic or participatory account of rationality. It has suggested that civilized reason is sustained only by a deeply animistic engagement with our own science. To tell the story in this manner, to provide an animistic account of reason rather than the other way around, is to imply that animism is the wider and more inclusive term, and that oral mimetic modes of experience still underlie and support all our literate and technological modes of reflection. When reflection's rootedness in such bodily participatory modes of experience is entirely unacknowledged or unconscious, then reflective reason becomes dysfunctional, unintentionally destroying the corporeal, sensuous world that sustains it. So, reason, not as the contrary of magic, but rather reason as a particular form of magic, suggesting that magic is not gone. The gods have not fled the world. They're just hiding in places that we take so much for granted that we don't notice them. Now, is this gesture the same one that John made, speaking of reason as a particular form of feeling? I just wonder if it's a new kind of gesture, one that overcomes dichotomous oppositions, not by canceling one of them or by relegating one of them to an inferior status and situating the other one as superior, but by nesting one of the terms within the other as a special case of the other, as one form of a multiplicity, which suggests that our dichotomies and dualisms don't so much function to block our awareness of unity, but rather to mask the world's outrageous multiplicity. That dualism enables us to hide from the irreducible pluralism of the real in its wonder. I'm wondering here, or maybe just realizing that I need to say a word about animism, or at least my understanding of animism. I don't for a moment think that animism is a belief system. I don't think it's a set of beliefs. It's an experience. I think it is our most basic, most ordinary human way of perceiving the world in the absence of intervening technologies. And that's key. But in the absence of technologies that come between our senses and the earthly sensuous, our animal senses spontaneously and gregariously participate in the things that they perceive. Merleau-Ponty writes beautifully of how the hand, which explores all the tactile and tangible surfaces, the textures of things, that this hand has its own textures, its own tangible thickness. That is, the hand is entirely a part of the tactile field that it explores. So when I reach out and touch and move my fingers along the bark of an aspen tree, I'm not just touching the tree, I'm also feeling myself touched by the aspen. There's this curious reciprocity to the sense of touch. But not just touch, it's there in each of our senses. The eyes, my eyes that explore the visible field, the visual field, encountering the colors of things, the shapes of things. Well, our eyes have their own shape. They have their own shiny surface, like the surface of a pond. They have their own colors, in my case, kind of a greenish brown. So when I come down in the morning and I rub my eyes free of sleep, and I open the door and gaze out at the forested hillside just across this small valley. I'm not just seeing those trees on the hillside. I'm also experiencing my own visibility. I'm feeling myself seen by that hillside. I feel exposed. Again, this reciprocity in seeing. And that this is so basic to us, that it's so ordinary, is attested by the discourse of pretty much every indigenous, traditionally oral culture we know of. Like the Koyukon people of Central Alaska, who say that they live in a world of eyes, that the forest is always looking at them, watching them. But also here in the Southwest Desert. I'm speaking to you folks from the high desert of the upper Rio Grande Valley in northern New Mexico, dotted with many native pueblos in this valley, and just above my home, the slopes of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So near here, the Navajo or Diné people, they say things like, I must be humble in the face of these mountains. I must be humble in the face of these grasses. All of these beings are looking at me. Therefore, I must take care how I walk. I must take care how I move. I think this sense of that the sensuous world is also sensate, and sensing us is very, very basic to us, very ordinary. So earlier in the blogs, I think someone said, it might be Tanny, I think it said, although we now know otherwise, our limited sensory apparatus tells us that objects are static. Paintings, chairs, mountains, or whatever. To our body minds, these things seem utterly unchanging. And I want to say, I completely disagree with that. I think our ordinary, unaided sensory experience, again, in the absence of intervening technologies, discloses a world that is alive through and through. Everything is animate, everything moves. It's just that some things move a lot slower than other things, like the walls of this house or the ground, and yet they still move. As we know from our indigenous brothers and sisters, they are simply among the vast majority, at least, of traditionally oral cultures. There is a resistance, even a refusal to make a clear boundary or bifurcation between that which is animate and that which is inanimate. I'm not wanting to generalize over much here. It's really dangerous when speaking about indigenous traditions as different as, the Koyukon people or the Hopi of the desert around here, or the Lakota of the plains, or the Guarani people or Kayapo of the Amazon basin, or the Sami of northern Scandinavia, or the Ogoni of Nigeria, Pitjantjatjara in Australia, Pintubi also in Australia. All of these cultures are so outrageously different from one another. I mean, sometimes so weirdly different that they seem utterly incommensurable. Like, how can they even inhabit the same planet or even the same solar system with their outrageously contrasting lifeways? And yet there are these few commonalities. A most basic one being this sense that everything is at least potentially alive. Everything is no thing is definitively inert or inanimate. And another, that everything speaks, that any sound can be a voice, any movement can be a gesture laden with expressive intent. So I think that this way of experiencing is kind of baseline for the human organism. It's our most ordinary, most normal way of encountering, of experiencing the world. With regard to writing or the written word, just to say very briefly, my take on writing, and in particular the alphabet, is when I say, as I mentioned in my footnote, that it's a very concentrated form of animism. All I mean is that when you come down in the morning and to the kitchen and you open up the newspaper and you focus your eyes upon these ostensibly inert or inanimate bits of ink on the page, straight away you hear voices and you see visions of conversations happening far away in the White House or off in Europe, as Angela Merkel is meeting with our so-called president, and or they're not meeting, they're not even talking to each other, but you see these interactions playing out and you hear conversations unfurling in other places. This is animism. This is magic. It's not that different from a Hopi woman stepping outside of the pueblo, walking within the desert and coming upon one of the many large boulders that are found around there, boulder covered with crinkly black and red lichen. And she focuses her eyes on one of those patches of lichen and suddenly hears the rock speaking to her. Or a Lakota man off walking in the forest, and suddenly his face snags on a spider web and he backs away and tries to see if he can find that spider. And when he catches sight of it, as it's trying to repair the web, this little spinning arachnid, his eyes focus on this little being and get drawn into this other scale of experience, and suddenly hears himself being addressed by the spider, spoken to. We just do it with our own scratches and scripts. Our oral ancestors were doing it with spider webs and bent twigs and patches of lichen and tracks of deer and moose and bear and mountains. That is writing, and particularly alphabetic writing. But I don't want to linger too much more on this basic thought. But writing is such a concentrated form of animism. I look at the letter B and I go, buh. I look at the letter C, I go, that is, as soon as I look at the letters, they dissolve into sound, they speak. As soon as I see a piece of writing, I see what it says. It says, it speaks to me instantly. It's such a concentrated form of magic that it effectively eclipses all of the other modes of participation in which our senses used to engage. So I think it's quite clear that it's only when formal writing systems emerge and well, heck, I'm going too far down that road. But just to say, different writing systems do this in different ways. If you have more iconic writing systems like um, Egyptian hieroglyphs or the Mayan hieroglyphics, um, or even the ideographic writing of China, the written characters, many of them drawn in a stylized fashion from images of humans and human implements interspersed with images of felines, of frogs, of clouds, of rain falling from those clouds, of sunrise, of moon, full moon. So when you're reading such a script, the reader is continually reminded of language's link to a much more than human world. It's as if, even if with writing, language, human language is beginning to close in on itself. So the landscape doesn't speak as vividly as it once did for our oral ancestors. Yet the written characters in a more ideographic or hieroglyphic writing system function as windows that still open onto that more than human landscape that still speaks. With a phonetic writing system, this is the last thing I'll say about this, with an alphabet, the glyphs, the written characters no longer image anything out there in the surrounding world. Again, I see the letter H and it points me back to my own mouth. And I go, huh. I see an M and I go, that is, the written characters no longer function as windows opening onto the landscape, but more as mirrors reflecting the human form back upon itself. Only as the alphabet comes into a priorly oral culture, usually carried by missionaries, teaching the good book and wanting to teach people their ABCs so they can read the Bible, only then does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human property. And everything else in the land begins to fall mute. Humans have language. Nothing else seems to speak meaningfully. But this is a very recent experience. This notion that we've got language and other animals don't, to say nothing of plants and mountains. Okay. I'll leave that aside now. Somebody in one of the blogs, Sarah Robinson, I think, wrote about a key reply to Descartes' claim, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, that a key reply would be Husserl's I can, therefore I am. And I think that's lovely and right on. But I'd like to suggest what may be an even more powerful response to Descartes. To Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It seems to me the most powerful corrective to that is you are, therefore I am. You are, therefore I am. The to put primacy not on anything I think or even that I do on my own, but on my encounter with the other, on the relation with otherness, with the other. You are, therefore I am. And I think, in speaking of the senses, it seems to me that synesthesia actually plays a key role in our relation to otherness. Synesthesia, by which I mean, as you all know, the blending of the senses, something I'm sure you've all experienced and probably that you've all thought about a fair amount. But let me try and reflect a little bit on synesthesia and the other, and maybe say something a little fresh. Obviously, neuroscientists, they give this name, synesthesia, to this coalescence of different senses, but they speak of it usually as a confusion of the nervous system. And it's commonly been viewed as a kind of pathology. So synesthetes, that is, persons beset by this supposed affliction, are liable to hear the sound of certain colors or to taste the flavor of certain sounds. Our civilization prizes analytic precision, breaking things down into their component parts. But it becomes frightened when things refuse to stay separate, when a person's senses flow together so that her entire body begins to function as an interrelated organ of perception, as a single complexly gifted sentience. Now, I've become convinced, and maybe you guys are as well, that synesthetic experience is not just commonplace, it's the very structure of perception. In our encounters with the world, our senses steadily intercommunicate and meld with one another. And it's only by conjoining different sensory modalities that our organism garners insights into the specific otherness that confronts us at any moment. So I don't mean to deny that our senses are distinct modalities, but I'm suggesting that the senses are different modalities of a single and unitary living body, that their complementary powers evolved in complex interdependence with each other. So each sense is a unique modality of this body's existence, but in the activity of perception, it's like a single example here. When I see a raven soaring in the distance and I turn to focus my gaze upon it, the raven is not for me just a visual image. As I'm following it with my eyes, I inevitably feel the stretch and the flex of its wings within my own muscles. And its sudden swoop toward the nearby trees is a visceral as well as a visual experience for me. And the raven's loud guttural cry as it swerves overhead, well, my throat's too dry, so I don't dare try and make that cry. But that cry is not circumscribed within a strictly audible field, right? It echoes through the visible. It immediately animates the visible landscape with the reckless style or mood proper to that jet black creature. My various senses, diverging as they do from a single coherent body, coherently converge as well in the perceived thing. So my senses connect up with each other in the things I perceive. Or rather, each perceived thing gathers my senses together in a coherent way. And it's this that enables me to experience the thing itself as a center of forces, as another nexus of experience, as an other. Another example. Suppose that you're out strolling near your house and a neighbor's dog comes bounding up and eager to be scratched under his collar and to chase a stick that he's hoping you'll toss for him. In order to do so, you have to wrestle the stick from his slobbering mouth. And that's something that can be accomplished only with a great amount of tugging to one side and yanking to the other, with the mutt yanking back, growling in the back of his throat, while, keeping his teeth locked on the wood. Soon he's probably going to let you have the stick, but for now the gusto of grappling with you is irresistible and the hound is putting up a good fight. At such a moment, you don't have distinct experiences of a visible dog, an auditory dog, and a tactile, furry, saliva-dripping dog. On the contrary, the dog is precisely the place where those divergent senses link up and dissolve into one another, merging as well with the dusky odor ghosting around him like a cloud. It seems to me perception is this very commingling of different senses in the beings we perceive. To simplify matters for a moment, let's just consider the sense of sight. even here within a single sense, we don't have one eye. We've got two eyes, two organs, each with its own angle of vision. But we don't commonly experience our left eye's perspective on like a clump of moss as distinct from our right eye's perspective on that moss. But rather the clump draws the two gazes together. The separate perspectives of our two eyes converge and merge in that emerald softness. And by virtue of their collaboration, we glean a sense of the thickness and depth of the moss. So the simplest act of seeing is already a kind of synesthesia. It's folding two gazes from two discrete eyes into a single vision. So just as a phenomenon seen by just one eye lacks apparent depth, so an object that impinges only upon a single sense, provoking neither the participation nor even the imagination of the other senses, then it remains just kind of a vague and insubstantial presence for us. It'll gain in substance and reality to the degree that it tempts the involvement of one or several of our other senses. So, for instance, the faint, high-pitched hum of a mosquito near our ears may be sufficient to set our arms swatting at the air, but this is because the sound already provokes a tactile association that, disturbs us, distresses me. But if we manage to catch a glimpse of that whirring sprite as he's weaving through the space around us, then the mosquito will acquire a more vivid and precise reality. And if it succeeds in drawing a bit of blood from our ankle or buttock, then the tangible sting will combine with that sound and that blurred motion, yielding a still stronger sense of this tiny being as a keen and willful adversary, as another shape of intentful life. So I'm strolling through Manhattan in the winter, listening to Marvin Gaye on my MP3 player with, headphones on. And I stopped to watch a graceful figure skater cutting sinuous patterns at the outdoor rink. With my headphones on, the skater seems a pretty piece of the scenery. Nice to notice, but basically just part of the view. When I slip off the headphones, the audible scrape of her blades fuses perfectly with the visible spray of fine powder as she swerves and whirls. And so I'm tucked into a visceral relation with the skater. The conjunction of my listening ears with my gazing eyes induces a subtle collaboration of my body with hers. So when the tip of one blade catches unexpectedly on the ice and she teeters, her limbs all akimbo before her shoulder slams down on that rock-hard surface, I feel the abrupt disequilibrium and then cringe as the ice seems to collide with my own bony shoulder, sending waves of excruciating sensation radiating across my torso before they subside into the sight of the skater now climbing to her feet. So it seems to me that the empathic propensity of our body is in a large part a consequence of the differentiation and divergence of our separate senses. Because it's only by turning our bodily attention toward another that we experience the convergence and reassembly of our separate senses into a dynamic unity. It's only by entering into relation with others that we affect our own integration and coherence. Such others might be people, or they might be wetlands, or works of art, or snakes slithering off through the stubbled grass. But this juncture, this joining of divergent senses over there in the other leads us to experience that other as a conjunction of experience in its own right, and hence as another subject, another source of powers. Incomplete on its own, the body is precisely our capacity for metamorphosis. Each being that I perceive enacts a subtle integration within me, even as it alters my prior organization. So I think of that beautiful line from Goethe, which in one translation says that every object rightly contemplated opens an organ within us for its contemplation. Every object rightly contemplated opens an organ within us for its contemplation. Anyway, I hope you follow the thought. It seems to me that I experience, it's through the differentiation of my senses as well as their spontaneous convergence in the things that I perceive in the world at large. It ensures that I'm a being destined for relationship, because it's primarily through my engagement with what's not me that I affect the integration of my senses. And in that way, experience my own unity, my own coherence. And this isn't true just for me, but for all of us. And in fact, it's true for our species as a whole. I mean, hence, the only, it's kind of a motto, I suppose, for me. It's the only sentence that repeats itself in my different books, which is, we are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human. That we're human only in contact and conviviality with what ain't human. Another thought. How did we lose our senses? I mean, how did we come to so distrust our sensory experience that in my high school and college science classes, I was taught not to trust my senses, that the senses are deceptive, that the truth is hidden behind the appearances, always, whether it's hidden inside the nucleus of my cells, in the strands of DNA and RNA that ostensibly code all of my experience, or whether it's hidden in the synapses between the neurons in my brain, that's the deep truth that explains my experience of the world, or it's hidden in the breaking of the initial symmetries in the Big Bang, outrageously far off in space and time. The sensuous world is always to be explained by dimensions that are hidden from our senses elsewhere. It seems to me, obviously, that distrust in our senses happens through many steps, but I think a very key one, it's so obvious that it seems to me most people never notice it, including and especially scholars. But we ought to look no farther than the Copernican revolution. And I have to add, I don't mean to be disparaging the Copernican revolution. I think Nikolai Copernicus was a really cool cat, as was Kepler and Tycho Brahe. And Giordano Bruno is one of my big heroes. But the Copernican moment was clearly the moment in which we lost trust in our animal senses. Because all of us, when we look at the sun, right, we see it moving across the sky, arcing across the sky. And whether we are physicists or farmers, when the sun is sliding down toward the horizon, we say, oh, the sun is sinking down. We say the sun is setting. And as it's climbing up in the east in the morning, whether we're, scientists or slackers, we say the sun is rising, because that is our most basic sensory experience of what's going on. But, after Copernicus and Galileo, this notion spread that, wait a minute, the sun is not moving at all. It's not moving. It's the earth that's moving. It's the earth that is turning. Don't trust your senses. The senses are deceptive. And that's when that notion that sensory experience is deceptive sort of spread into the sciences, which was a great loss because it seems to me the senses are our only real access to the real, to the sensuous, to the earth itself. If I don't trust my senses, if I think the truth is somewhere else, then I'm completely dependent upon experts to tell me what's really coming down. And I'm massively susceptible to being manipulated by others. But maybe this situation that's so cut us off from the intelligence of our senses and so estranged from the palpable earth is because we haven't yet really completed the Copernican revolution, haven't yet brought its discoveries back down to earth. But I want to say something else here as my last main theme in this wrap, and then we can pick up in discussion any of these notions or matters. It seems to me that our solitary sense of inwardness, I mean, I'll come back to Copernicus, but our solitary sense of an interior mindscape that to which I alone have access, to which you alone have access, that we each have this private interior life. It seems to me it was largely born of the forgetting or sublimation of a much more ancient interiority that was once our common birthright. The ancestral sense of the surrounding earthly cosmos as the voluminous inside of an immense body or tent or temple. Before the invention of the telescope, which happens right around the time of Galileo, right? He's one of the first cats to actually use a telescope. Before the invention of the telescope, though, which is really recent, the glimmering stars of the night sky appeared way closer than they do to us today. For the ancient Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, right, the vault of the sky was considered the canopy of an enormous tent held up by the mountains that rise at the boundaries of the world. For the Haida people and the Kwakwakwa people, seafaring tribes of wood carvers and wordsmiths who inhabit the archipelago off the west coast of what's now called Canada. For the Haida, to enter into one of their traditional cedar plank houses was to situate yourself within a living analog of the cosmos, because the universe itself was experienced as a huge house, a big long house with holes between the planks where the stars were glimmering through. Similarly, a Navajo hogan, the traditional dwelling of the Diné people here in the Southwest Desert, is held by them to be a microcosm of the enveloping house of the world. In the absence of telescopes, some such conception of the cosmos as an immense interior or enclosure seems to have been common to a large majority of human cultures, as though a sense of the interiority of the surrounding world, this big, broad house of earth and sky, is all but irresistible for the human creature. Well, it seems to me that the cosmology of Aristotle and Ptolemy, which held sway throughout Europe until the 17th century, was itself a refined instance of this very same notion. You all probably have some sense of the Ptolemaic cosmos. It held that the universe was a nested series of concentric crystalline spheres turning independent of one another around the central solid sphere of the Earth. And each of these transparent and hence invisible spheres, these crystalline spheres, carried one of the celestial bodies on its surface as it moved. And because to our unaided vision, there were only 7 independently moving bodies in the night sky, So in the pre-Copernican universe, there were 7 concentric, transparent crystalline spheres carrying the sun, the moon, and each of the visible planets on its surface, along with an 8th outermost sphere carrying the fixed stars as it turned. The sphere closest to us was that which carried the moon, followed by the one that was carrying Mercury, and then Venus, and then the sphere bearing the fiery sun on its surface. And beyond that turned the sphere holding Mars, and then Jupiter, and then Saturn, which was the outermost planet known to our naked eye. And then finally, the background sphere of the fixed stars. And everything under the lunar sphere was called the sublunar realm, where we lived. There was a huge intimacy to this vision of the cosmos with its invisible but ordered spheres enveloping the earth, cradling this world in their embrace. For all of its complexity and observational refinement, this remained an extension of our ancestral indigenous take on the universe as an immense enclosure. And so when Copernicus and his followers wrecked this Aristotelian image of the cosmos, Western civilization suffered the dissolution of the last long-standing version of that immense collective interior. We, I think, today can hardly experience the outrageous disorientation, the visceral vertigo precipitated by this shift, as first the spheres holding the planets, and then even the outermost sphere of fixed stars abruptly dissolved into a boundless depth. Europeans soon found themselves adrift in a limitless space, a pure outside. Only in the wake of this dramatic disorientation and the loss of a collective interior did there arise the modern conception of mind as an entirely private interior, and hence of each person as an autonomous, isolated individual carrying around this vast world inside herself. Psychological properties, psychological qualities that were once felt to be proper to the surrounding terrain, feeling tones, moods, the animating spirits of place known to reside in particular wetlands or forests, the spirits, all lost their home with the dissolution of the enclosing wombish nature of the pre-Copernican cosmos, because unlike quantities, qualities are fluid properties arising from the internal felt relations between things. Such feeling tones now had no place in the physical world, itself newly conceived as a set of objects that had no internal relation to one another. Nature was beginning to be experienced as a pure exterior, a world of external mechanical relationships, a world of quantities. I mean, and it's only natural that psychological qualities fled from this open exteriority in the wake of the Copernican revolution, taking refuge in the private space now assumed to exist inside each of us, because it seems to me that feelings and moods, like the genius loci, like spirits of place, they require at least a provisional sense of enclosure, because they're mercurial powers, they're fluid. Yeah, mercurial. They need a provisional sense of enclosure to hold them. Once they could no longer be contained by the sensuous cosmos, no longer held inside the curved embrace of the spheres, these fluid qualities quit the so-called outer world entirely, taking up residence within the new interiority of each person's inner world. And henceforth, they'll be construed as merely subjective phenomena. Now, it seems to me that the dissolution of the concentric crystalline spheres of the Ptolemaic cosmos actually opened the way for the very slow, gradual discovery of a new collective interiority. Less exalted than that earlier cosmos, but way more wondrous. After 3.5 centuries spent charting and measuring material nature as though it were a pure outside, we've at last begun to notice that the world we inhabit, from the ocean floor to the upper atmosphere, is alive. The feelings that move through us, the frights and yearnings that color our days, and the flights of fancy that sometimes seize us, the creativity that surges through us, all are born of the ongoing interchange between our life and the wider life that surrounds us. They are no more our moods, our creativity, than they are the Earth's. They blow through us and they often change us, but they're not our private possession, nor an exclusively human property of our species. With the other animals, with the crinkled lichens and the river-carved rocks, we're all implicated within this intimate and curiously infinite world, poised between the tactile landscape underfoot and the leaden sky overhead, between the floor and the ceiling. Each of us crouching or tumbling or swooping within this same big interior, inside the world. So that's the final thought I'm wanting to leave us with or open this onto. I'm trying to say that we don't live on the earth. We live in the earth. For so many centuries, it's been assumed that the atmosphere, the air that swirls around us, was just a bunch of gases that just happen to be drawn down to Earth by Earth's gravity. But in the early 1970s, Jim Lovelock, an atmospheric geochemist, realized that there was something very weird about the air, that the chemical composition of Earth's atmosphere was very far from equilibrium, composed of various chemical gases that should be canceling each other out and coming to a very different proportion of those gases. And yet it stayed in this same composition, in this very far from equilibrium composition. And Lovelock suddenly realized, holy shit, that the air itself must be continually being monitored and modulated and generated by the sum of all of the organic life on Earth's surface, by the soils, by the oceans, by the animals, by the plants, all of us interbreathing with one another. And in that sense, percolating into existence, this atmosphere that is then an organ of this breathing biosphere. We don't live on the surface of the earth. We live down here in the depths of this invisible fluid membrane we call the earth. The air, it turns out, is the very signature of a living planet. And we've been speaking, or whether writing back and forth about the matter of spirit and spirituality, or what I prefer to call the spirits. But what I want to say is that our long presumption that the spirit is somewhere else, or that, well, it seems rooted in our sense that the invisible world is elsewhere, that here we are in the visible world and the invisible world is somewhere else, above the visible or behind the visible world, beyond it in some sense. And that's a presumption that seems really goofy to me, because the invisible, just as the word says, is in the visible. It's right here. The air itself. In fact, the visible world could not exist without the invisible in this very palpable material sense. I wouldn't be able to see anything else at all if the air was not invisible. If it was visible, the air would block up our vision and we wouldn't be able to see anything else. The air is both utterly transcendent and utterly immanent, both at once. Transcendent because it's invisible. I can't see it. I can't grasp it, can't map it. And yet it's uttermost immanence because it's up against us, up against our eyeballs, in our nostrils, circulating through our lungs and our limbs. And so for our indigenous oral ancestors, the air was uttermost magic. And this one example of that for the Navajo, their most cosmological or almost monotheistic power is something they call nilchi, nilchi, which means the holy wind. And the holy wind is the whole body of the air around us, including the sky overhead. It is holy because it's invisible, because you can't see it. You can only see it by the traces that it leaves. But it's holy, and the holy wind or nilchi is what gives all things life and breath and awareness. Awareness. So the early missionaries translated this as, well, they heard the Navajo, the Diné elders, speaking of the wind within one. And they thought, oh, that's like the personal spirit of our tradition. And so they translated the wind within one as the personal spirit, but they missed that the wind within one is entirely continuous with the wind all around one. And the Navajos say you can only see the wind by these spiraling patterns, these traces it leaves. So wherever you see a spiral in the world, you know that holy wind has been there. And so the spiraling patterns in our fingertips are where 10 little winds entered into our fingers when we were born. And the spiraling patterns in our toe tips are where 10 little winds entered into our toe tips when we were born. And the winds in our fingertips hold us to the sky, and the winds in our toe tips hold us to the ground. And that's why we don't fall down when we're walking, because the winds are holding us to the sky and to the ground. But they also say that we have these spiraling patterns in the folds of our ears, these little spiraling folds. And that's how we know that there are two little winds, one hanging out in each of our ears. Wind's children, they call them. And when we are thinking thoughts, when you hear that surge of words within your ears, the Navajo elders say that's just wind's children talking to you from inside your ears. But these little wind's children are just messengers of the winds of the four directions, who themselves are parts of the big body of Nilti, or holy wind. So our thoughts are being thunk, not by us, but by the wind. And this can seem really weird to us until we notice the evidences in our own words, like the word spirit, which shares the same origin as the word respiration, the old Latin word spiritus, which originally meant a breath or a gust of wind. Or our word psyche, from which we get psychology and psychiatry. Psyche comes from where? As you all know, from that old Greek word, psyche. The verb, psychein, meant to breathe or to blow, like the wind. But a psyche, or a psyche, was a gust of wind or a breath of air. Even the Latin word for the soul, anima, from which we get animal, an ensouled being, or unanimous, being of one soul. Where does that come from? The older Greek term, anemos, which meant wind. Even this very scientifically respectable word, atmosphere, where do we get that word? Well, it's cognate with the Sanskrit atman, which means soul. The old Indo-European root, atmos, meant the soul which is the air which is the soul. So with that, I just end my wrap. We've been using the beautiful term coined by Thich Nhat Hanh, interbeing, but I want to supplement it with another term, interbreathing, that we animals are interbreathing with one another and with the plants who are breathing out the oxygen that all us animals breathe in. And we then breathe out the carbon dioxide that all those plants need to breathe in. All of us interbreathing, percolating into existence this invisible mysterium in which we're immersed. End of wrap. Thank you guys for listening.
David, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have about 50 little Post-it notes here. You've given us so much. I want to say, I want to hand it over to the panel for sure, but I want to say that, you know, you talk about the dimensions that are inaccessible to our senses, okay, that are hidden from our senses. Not that they are, but we're encouraged to consider those, you know, the truth, whereas, you know, the things that appear to our senses, it's all illusion, right? But, you know, going back to, and that was my comment, you know, I know intellectually that the mountain is moving. Mountains are always moving. Everything is moving. I know, but I don't experience it that way. So you're telling me to distrust my senses, you know? So I'm wondering why is it that I don't experience it that way? Is it that I have been taught that mountains are still, and so that's how I actually see it?
I mean, I would say largely yes. I think there was this quote from you in one of the blogs. You said, I adore this idea of changing nouns into verbs, but I'm having trouble imagining what it would do to our actual experience of the world. It's actually not that hard to imagine what it would. We would more and more, we would just become animists, because that's all animism is. When one says, you know, the mountain is alive, the rocks have their vitality or their inward pulse, their interior anima. It's simply that one is dropping underneath this bizarre presumption that that our animal body experiences anything directly as utterly inert, inanimate. We say in English, right? We say something captures my attention or catches my gaze or calls my awareness. Those are very precise ways of speaking. That's exactly how the world is experienced by us. As you're wandering through your home or stepping out your door and down to the street, something catches your gaze, catches your eyes, and you turn toward it. Maybe it's a dry leaf stuck to the ground. And so you turn toward it and it shows itself. It replies by showing something more of itself. It's the vividness of its color. And so you reply to that by bending down to touch that leaf or to pick it up, to which it then replies by showing you the other side of itself. And so you're in this nonverbal conversation between your body and the body of that leaf. That's all perception is. It's this ongoing conversation with things. If things weren't enigmatic to us, we wouldn't see them. We'd see them all at once and so not see them at all. It's because they dynamically engage us. But there's always some part of each thing, of each rock, of each of each tree or boulder that I don't see directly, like the other side of a tree that I'm walking past in the field. And it's that gap that beckons my awareness and that holds my attention. But if I walk around the tree to gaze its other side, well, there's still the whole inside of the tree that I don't see directly. Who knows, you know? It could be hollow. Or when I'm walking past the tree at first, the other side of it could be just, I mean, I don't see it, so it might just be covered with a sheet of plastic and with bright orange polka dots on it. It's possible because I don't see it directly. Nonetheless, the imagination of my eyes fills in the other side of that tree trunk with bark, a lot like what I see on this side. The inside of the tree, even if I walk around it, I don't see that interior. It could be hollow, could have a bunch of rope ladders in it with tiny, tiny little elves climbing up and down on the rope ladders and yodeling to one another. Who knows? I don't have any direct experience of it.
Yeah.
But the imagination of my senses lends something of my own visceral density to that tree. And so I actually sense it as a solid, thick presence. So what I'm saying here too is that imagination belongs first to the senses. It's that gregarious leading edge of our eyes, of our ears, of our skin, that they're always throwing themselves beyond what's immediately given in order to make deeper contact with things and with the world. The idea that things are felt as just inert, inanimate, static, that's just a concept. I don't think it's a percept. I think you're experiencing a concept.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Thank you for that. That's a very good answer. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to say what David was just talking about, and also earlier about our participatory way and also imaginative dimensions of our senses. It reminds me that every baby that comes into the world sees the world that way. You know, every 21st century mother and is meeting the original baby and without all that schooling and telling them how not to see. So preschoolers have a very immediate sense of their favorite tree, and especially if they spend time outdoors in a garden or a park, you know, but even indoors, they see their stuffed animals as being alive. But they really feel the tree is their friend, and you can see in an indigenous culture, the parents would listen to that and look at that and say, you're making a good start. This is a good beginning. As you get older, you'll learn the elaboration of our culture about this through art and, you know, our ways. But in a Western culture, of course, the parents listen to that and say, oh, well, that's because your brain's not developed. Wait till you get in school, you'll get straightened out. You know, the tree is not your friend. It's just a tree. So it's like this stubborn recurrence of that. No matter how much conditioning there is, you're faced with it every time there's a new human. It's exactly the way David's talking about. So I just see that as a reminder to us, you know, that it's not natural the way we end up socialized.
Yeah, and just to say super briefly, it's so beautifully put, and what you say, Charlene, and that childlike experience of the tree or an apple tree as my friend, and I get to play with it, and but if it's not cut and aborted, if, you know, as I watched this with both of my kids. My daughter had a close apple tree outside her home as she was, that she felt very much as a friend. But gradually, as she just got a few years older, she began to realize that, whoa, the tree can't move around like I do. It's rooted in place. And so what's that like? So she was stretching her imagination to feel how the tree is experiencing movement or non-movement. And then if it's not aborted, usually in our culture at around 6, 7 years of age, it's cut, particularly when kids learn to read and write, they gain access to, the adults world. All that stuff is just a set of determinate objects. But if it's not cut and severed, it matures steadily into a rich sense of the otherness of trees, of apple trees, of mountains, so that by the time you are 15, 16, you know what it's like to think like a mountain, as Aldo Leopold puts it. So it becomes a deeply ethical relation to the world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I just want to add one more thing. I think the reason children come into the world and feel that profound dynamic interrelatedness is that's how they were formed. They just came from 9 months of profound dynamic interrelated with body of the mother, and then this intimate relationship with the mother and father, and of course they see the world that way. It's of them. It's how else would they see it? But it's regarded as, oh, your brain's not formed well enough to think straight yet.
Right.
Stephanie, you had something?
Well, I'm going to recast some of the things that you've brought forth, David, if you will let me.
Please.
We're talking about the animism of, say, indigenous people, or our ancestors, and I'm thinking about how some of that and some of the things that you've described are wonderful and lyrical, and are interconnected. But what about the degree to which that idea that these other things are possessed of a spirit have also motivated us to want to possess that spirit? I'm thinking of the shaman who has the leopard skin, or we kill the other animals, and we don ourselves with those skins. That we can talk about that idea of possessing that force of something that has in fact led us into the times where only now we have found, we've talked about that before, where our technologies and our projections and our wonderful things have become more sophisticated. I mean, the example that I'm giving where, the history where we have named our cars after these beings that are of those powers. And to kind of even flip that, I would suggest that a lot of those people who are enamored of machines are not looking at them as simply, oh, this is going to be a thing that's going to get me from point A to point Z. But they love, the whole sensory experience of, say, the machine, the way it smells, the way it feels, the way that there's a totality of a sensory experience of some of these other things which are extensions of the natural, if you will. So that, is there something inherently, in being more attuned to our senses as a way of interacting with the world, necessarily going to be any more somehow of this situating ourselves in a way that's more full and open and necessarily better?
It's a complex question. I'll just say first maybe that I don't, I meant to say that animism in this very basic sense is not just a property common to our indigenous ancestors, that it's very basic to every one of us. But I don't think it's, I'm not able to frame it really as that things possess a spirit. That things are spirits, that's closer. That the body of this aspen tree outside my window is a spirit. It's the body of that sentient presence that partakes of the spirit. For me, spirit is, it's deeply linked to the air and the wind. And since trees breathe, since they need to take up that, carbon-infused air that all us animals breathe out for their photosynthetic metabolism, it very much is engaged in this dance with the spirits, or with the spirit of the wind, with the spirit of the air. And it itself is a living presence, a being. I just don't want to separate and sever a sense that there is the essence of the tree that lives inside its non-essential body. The body is its essence. The body is the bodying forth of its modality of feeling, its ways of tasting and experiencing and slurping up water with its roots. So my sense also is that in an indigenous context, the magicians, and I should say that that was my early craft, my profession, was that of a sleight of hand magician who put myself through college doing sleight of hand magic. I was house magician at Alice's Restaurant, if some of you know the name of that storied place. But when I got done with college, I took off traveling through Southeast Asia, through Nepal, through Sri Lanka, as an itinerant magician looking to meet the traditional magicians, or shamans, as you were calling, who practice their craft in those cultures. But to approach them not outwardly as an anthropologist or as a researcher, but as a magician in my own right. I wanted to learn from them. And I ultimately got in way over my head. But I never experienced, in my very limited experience, anyone trying to possess the spirit of another being. Rather, they are invoking and looking to be possessed at times by raven, by deer, by antelope. And it does seem to me that that's a very basic propensity of our human form, of the body. It seems to me this body is our very capacity for metamorphosis and shape-shifting, because we are, composed of the same stuff as the world. We are variants of any other creature we might encounter. And like plants, we've got our own leafy skin surface. And like streams and rivers, we've got our blood surging within us. Like mountains and rocks, we have our stony, bony skeleton. That is, we are a variant of each thing that we encounter in the world, and hence are able to lean into, empathize with, pick up a vibration or a gesture or a glimmer of sensation and sentience from any other power we want to hang out with. And
what you're saying, resonates with me. I guess I'm problematizing it a bit because, I can give you, I come originally from southwestern Pennsylvania, coal country. All of those fellows, who over the years have been going down into the earth and pulling out, this material that is, this, and Christine could speak much better to the nature of that material than I ever could. They don't think of it as some inert matter. They of all people, think of this as a living, wonderful, wondrous thing. And yet, if we were to go there today, and now with what we know, what wrenching all of this material out of the earth is actually doing, they still want to do that, even though they know. They know more than know. They sense, what it's about, and that's what I'm, I guess I'm suggesting, or asking, or raising the issue of just the complexity of what, that in and of itself, that attunement to the way in which this life and this energy and how we're all connected to it does not necessarily in and of itself. And it's, I'm thinking, over these days about how, we're talking about rationality, intelligence, and what we are as humans, but I keep thinking about us humans and our dysfunction. That how so much dysfunction is a part of us, that we can take any system, no matter how inherently wondrous and beautiful, and take it down the wrong pathway,
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And for me, I think the difference that makes the difference is when, and my experience in the tiny handful of indigenous cultures I had the luck to live among for short stretches of time, including among the Puebloan folks here, is that when the human feels itself as just one form among this outrageous multiplicity of shape and style and sensitivity and sentience, we are sentient, but we have it in this shape. And a spider's got it in this other very different shape at a whole other scale that I don't know anything about, but the spider's way tuned into that. It's one stands in a relation of humility to everything else and a kind of astonished awe and wonder in relation to the many-shaped weirdness of the world, and also in a stance of tremendous care and caution, because any of these other beings, because it is alive, because it has its own way in the world. I mean, some of them are much bigger than me and can eat me, and some are way smaller than me and even smaller than the spider, and can take me down, like a COVID-19 virus. That is, if I'm not respectful, if I don't respect the otherness in each of these other beings, it can take me out all too readily and all too easily. It'll bring majorly bad luck upon my family, and but not just bad luck, that is, will fall sick, and I might find one of my kids dying. So there are the animistic style and sensibility has a kind of humility, it seems to me, baked into it. And I'm struck that in English, our word human comes from that same source as the word humility, being the humus, both from the humus, and being humble is being close to that humus, that soil. I feel like one finds this in so many languages, that there is this intuition that what is most human, or we are most human when we are humble, when we stand in a humble relation to everything else, not trying to manipulate them, to possess them, but celebrating them, praising them, at least being fascinated by them, and sometimes praising them. Yeah.
Jane?
I wasn't sure if I have to leave soon, but so I'll just read you what I wrote in the chat. Thank you.
No, there was.
Yeah, I just put it in there because I thought I was going to have to go. But just thank you. I've been a reader and lover of your books, so it's a real pleasure to be able to hear you and engage with you in this small setting. Thank you, everybody, and Taney. My question was along the lines maybe of what Stephanie, I think, was getting at, but I'm not sure, but I think so. And I get this question a lot because I share so much of your perspective, your encounters and your experiences and the way of, but my question was about the sort of imagery of the coherent and the harmonious holism of the entangled encounters. And you probably get this question all the time. Yeah. So one of the ways that I've tried to respond to that is to make a place in my story for things that are absurd, and I've been thinking about Dada, and I'm teaching a class on Dada. They're good at the absurd, or that there's an ill-fittedness sometimes, or there's a dimension of ourselves in our encounters where there's not a meaningfulness. Meaning isn't the yield, but it's something awry, which is okay. It's just not. It doesn't yield meaning, and it doesn't. And yeah, so that kind of thing. So maybe an entangled, lively world, but not a harmonious, coherent one in the ways that you associated. Probably, I take your word for it, with various indigenous cosmologies, or maybe not. Yeah, and then that's why. Just so another short way is that's why I've been drawn to that's why I'm drawn to Deleuze and Guattari, because they add in that weird. Not just weird in a way that's ultimately meaningful, but profoundly absurd dimension of the human experience. So that's the kind of thing. But not just them, like Merritt Oppenheim and Rosie Brodati and Jack Halberstam. Those are my kind of people that I turn to try to add that dimension in. Just what do you think of that?
First of all, I have to say, it's wonderful meeting you, because I loved reading your work as well. I couldn't agree more. For me, the weird, the awkward, the odd, the confused is utterly of the essence. I certainly didn't use the word harmonious. I don't think I certainly didn't intend to. I'm sort of startled if I did. I was only using the word coherent to speak of that my body has a coherence, that my senses diverge from a singular organism, that is this particular body, but they continually converge in the things that I perceive, but without encountering another, without encountering the otherness of the other, whether that other be an anthill, or a storm cloud, or a car door patiently rusting at the car graveyard with its viridian paint flaking off in the desert heat. It's an other, and it gathers my senses back together in some manner or other that has a coherence. What kind of, well, the coherence of viridian paint and that slanted car door. And it's, so I don't mean harmonious or coherent in any sense that the world has a harmony or the world carries a coherence. That, for me, I am Jewish and I feel quite close to my tradition, but I'm not a monotheist because I don't do oneness. I can't make head or tail of it. For me, to open up our animal senses onto the sensuous in all its outrageous multiform weirdness, its inexhaustibly strange ways, is to open onto the radical, irreducible pluralism of the world, much of which is edgy, is majorly dangerous to me, and massively confusing. I mean, I would say dazed and confused is my most basic state of mind. So I couldn't agree more. And I think it is an utter necessity and a key challenge to make sure that this gets into our writing and our articulation of whatever it is we are on about. The world the animistic world, the last thing it is sweet. It's fucking dangerous. To feel each thing in its agency and potency is you know, is to walk very, very gently, because there are things out and about that can eat you and ultimately will. So
And no, thank you. Thank you.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Werner.
David, thank you. It's been wonderful to listen to you. My question, maybe you've answered this already. I thought you made a very good point about the Copernican revolution, that being the point at which we started to distrust our senses. And I wonder if that ties into maybe the cultural schisms that we see today. You know, distrust of authority and you know, being told that what you sense to be true really isn't true, and how dare you, right? But my question really is, we've let the genie out of the bottle. How do we get it back in? Do we even try? You know, maybe science is the boogeyman that has perpetrated this disavowal of the senses. And so if we're to reconcile that, what does science look like in the future?
Yeah, it's certainly not a boogeyman for me. I've learned much of what I know from the natural sciences, as well as, you know, from several different cultures. But well, first I was trying, and sorry to, you know, load so many different thoughts into my rap for you guys. It's just rare I get a chance to speak to artists, musicians, folks who work the medium of sensory experience. I was trying to suggest at the end that there is a kind of bringing the Copernican revolution down to earth, that is beginning to rediscover also the interiority of the so-called outer world. But now it's not the inside of the cosmos itself and the sphere of fixed stars as the outer bound of our intimate wombish world, but it's the earth itself. It's this vastness, this intimate cosmos we call Earth, would, it seems to me, bring us back to our senses in a whole new and fresh way, but a sense of the primacy of the sensuous, which is also the primacy of the local and of place, and of paying attention to the differences between places. Here in the high desert, the qualities in the air, the qualities in that of colors that beset my eyes, the whole soundscape is so different from that in the Hudson River estuary where I grew up. And both are so different from the Amazon basin, and the qualities there, and the critters that live in that terrain, and the plants rooted in those soils. Each place its own style of sentience, its own state of mind, really, each place. A science that carries forward from what you all have been pondering in these last 8-9 days. It seems to me, Werner, would be a science that is no longer wielding its methods and the rich experimental method to figure out the world as if from outside, as if somehow the human mind or the scientific intellect could somehow spring itself free from its co-evolved carnal embedment in the midst of this blooming, buzzing proliferation of life, and hover outside the world and get at it from outside, figure it out. How does it work? So I study a humpback whale to figure out how the humpback whale actually works. What are its mechanisms? No, a more genuine, a more mature science that had grown out of that adolescent phase would be studying the humpback to learn how can humpbacks and us humans live in proximity to one another and both flourish. How can I study this wetland to learn not how the wetland works in itself objectively, but to get insights into how can humans and wetlands live in relation to one another that enables both to flourish. That is, it's a science that is in service not to humankind, but is in service to the whole more than human Earth. And I think there are examples of that all over. Conservation biology certainly moves in that direction. Someone like, Jane Goodall was calling us evermore, is still calling us into, okay, if you're going to study these primates, chimpanzees, it can't just be about, learning about them for yourself. It has to be about learning how to live in relation with them in a way that doesn't destroy all their habitat, et cetera, et cetera. How would science structure itself if it felt itself in service, not to humans alone, but to the whole breathing body of the planet in all its many-voiced weirdness? Yeah. Is that sort of a beginning of an answer?
Sure, yeah. That certainly makes sense. And I, as a scientist, I can see the shift. Sorry?
What's your science? What's your craft?
So my background's in particle physics.
Oh, wonderful.
And I can appreciate the shift, 180 shift in perspective that would take. And I'm trying to reconcile that with reasons a scientist goes into the field to begin with, which in its purest form is pure curiosity. Is sheer curiosity. Curiosity as one of the quieter emotions, right? It is to satisfy a basic urge. And in that sense, it's in that sense that I think of science as a sensual pursuit. And is it possible and in that vein, you want to discover everything you can about the thing you're studying, right? It's the compulsion to always dig deeper. When the moment you've answered one question, another question comes up. And so you're following that trail onward and onward. And it sounds to me like placing that inquiry in the context of everything else. With respect, honoring in a way that honors everything else, would sound to a scientist like curtailing their curiosity, drawing a boundary beyond which one would be better not to cross. And so it could possibly be problematic in that sense. I'm not saying that isn't a reason not to try.
Yeah, I reckon that it would involve a new sense of limits and boundaries that one maybe ought not to cross. I mean, like, for instance, going into the nucleus of of the atom, maybe that was a bit of a weird transgression that has unleashed powers that we don't have the ethical savvy to know how to move with, or stepping into the nucleus of the cell, for that matter, and beginning to manipulate the genome. I think if we carried something of a more than human, a respect for the more than human field of life, we might not have gone there. There's so much, but I'm still saying there's so much that could and still hugely engage our curiosity, but it would be in service to living well, in service to living as part of the whole biotic community, not just.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And we have one such question on our hands right now, which is with CRISPR and gene editing. It's the whole field of bioethics has a lot to do right now, and how that informs the actual research that people want to do. It's a slippery question.
It does link to, I mean, what I was saying about the scientific intellect sometimes trying to get at the world as if from outside the world.
Mm-hmm.
If I might just use that as a bridge to something that I think it's awfully important to bring up here, given the discussions you all have been having, which is just to speak a little bit about language. And I'd love to get your all sense of this, but a lot of this stems from our sense that language gets at the world from outside, that language is this representational medium that represents things. Words, the word aspen tree represents that tree outside my window. But it seems to me that too is very, very recent presumption with regard to language. That it's as though language were, well, William Burroughs had this notion, right? Language is a virus from outer space, as if language gets at the world from outside. But that's so bizarre, because words, phrases, song, stuttering bubbles up in the midst of the world, between us and one another, but between us and a world that itself speaks. And all of our human languages, whether it be Inuktitut or English or French or Swahili, originates in a deeply animistic context, wherein it was assumed that everything speaks, though most things don't speak in words, but things speak. And so human language was born, it seems to me, in a kind of call and response with a speaking world. And so I'll leap just from there to just say, it seems like a big part of the goof of our current mess is we all wield our words. Oh, that's too bright for my eyes. We all speak these days, particularly in this country, and particularly those of us who are overeducated, but much of the general populace also speaks as using words that are very, very abstract or jargon-ridden, words that it's as if we're speaking as disembodied minds to other disembodied minds, especially academics, right? But using words that have for so long been uprooted from the soil that all the dirt's fallen off their roots, and you can't sort of get any feel from the word. If I speak of phenomenology, which in some ways is my field, or intersectionality, or I mean, post-humanism, but it's words that you kind of have to retreat from your senses and crawl up into your head in order to understand what's being spoken and what's being said. It seems to me that we all have a responsibility now, if we are speaking of getting past the kind of anthropocentrism that's had us so long in its grip, to begin trying to speak as full-bodied creatures to other full-bodied creatures. That is, using words and phrases that paying attention to the texture and tonality of our phrases, to the rhythm of our speaking, to the sound spell of words, that then anybody who's listening to you has to sort of drip down from their cortex into their muscled body and their skin senses to hear you. And so by speaking in more embodied ways, we infect others around us and the culture at large with, we bring folks more and more into the thick of their own animal flesh, and hence open into the more than human animal sensuous. In fact, I mean, there is one person who's in the blogging who actually does this very well, and that's John Sakata. I've been noticing with sheer delight how, I mean, it's been a discussion about, I guess I need to turn that on. It's been a discussion about form and matter, or form and content, but one person in particular has been, in your ways of writing, John, it has seemed to me that what you're floating the content or the meaning in the sound and the shape, sometimes even just in the textual shape of what you're saying, which is the most palpable way that each of us, since we're all speaking beings and writing beings, can be working to resolve this dichotomy between form and content by floating the content right there within the form. I mean, having the form of our speaking and of our writing carry something of what we're trying to say. When I started work on my second book, I was writing in my studio. I was living in Idaho, and my studio was the garage, actually, and I had the door open, and a coyote came loping past, and I realized that I want to write so that if someone was reading aloud what I was writing, and a coyote came loping past the door, she would understand something of what was being said, would pick up some of the meaning just from the sound of what was being said. And that is how I try and write, but it's of course an utterly impossible, I mean, it's nonsensical ideal, but I have found it very useful as an ideal to keep me from flying off into more and more abstraction. I think we need to think with our body, with our animal skin, and not just with our heads. And the simplest way to also be doing that more is to be speaking as full-bodied creatures, using words that jangle our senses or tickle our nose and make us sneeze, or or that grate on us, but that have physical resonance. John, does this make any sense to your?
Well, I was all ready to say something very different.
Sorry, man.
Let me say what I want to say.
Yeah, please.
I mean, there's a multiplicity of things I feel deep gratitude to you. And one of them, I think that's come out both in your talk today and reading your work, is to give flesh to the invisible. That I think I wrote very early in the post about Klosowski and the notion of the breath, right? And how to make the breath have flesh.
Yes.
And it's been a really long, difficult, creative problem that I keep on failing at, of how to do that, in whether in playing or in composition or what have you. But you know, I think the word eros that you've used, not today, but in your writing, I think this desire to be implicated in the plea, le pli, right? The fold, to be enfolded
Yes.
in a manifold way, that to never be free of that, but actually to be completely enfolded and bound in the flesh of the invisible, and in the flesh of our relationships with each other. So actually, that's all I want to say. But thank you, David. Really.
Oh yeah, thank you, man. Yeah, so that's, and I know we're just verging on the hour. So, but if we can linger a little longer, because it's delicious speaking with you guys. But this, what you're saying, John, about the impulse to be implicated, to be in the plea, enfolded. I can't. Yeah, it's really central to all my work. Is a very palpable sense of being inside something, and that's why I was brought that up in my speaking before, that we don't live on but in the earth, or what you may know I tend to speak of as the earth, to take the letter I and insert it in the name of our planet, in the middle of it, and spell it EAIRTH, in order to say that the I, which is that upright slash we use to speak of the self, I can't but help but feel like the I is actually a pictogram of the upright spine of this primate walking around on all fours, but at a certain point actually standing up and balancing on its hind legs. The I as a pictogram of the upright spine, but taking the I and inserting it in the name of our planet Earth, to say that I am in the air, AIR, and the air is entirely a part of the earth, EAIRTH. I'm immersed, I'm embedded, I'm born of this earth. But that sense that I was trying to nudge toward earlier, that the biggest difference, it seems to me, and I've not seen anybody else, write or speak of this, but it seems to me the simplest, most palpable difference between the experience of my indigenous friends when they are in their home communities and our literate, over-civilized experience of the world. The biggest contrast between the oral, indigenous felt awareness of things and our felt awareness is that all of that creativity and lucid flux and dynamism that we associate with mind or consciousness, and all that feeling full emotional richness that we now hold inside us, for my indigenous brothers and sisters, is felt to be out here all around us, because consciousness is not something in us, it's something, there is something interior about it, but not because it's in us, but because we're inside it, bodily, along with all the other animals and the plants, because we are bodily immersed in a mind that's not ours, but I think is Earth's. And I think the edge where we're all at in this goofy culture is just verging on the possibility of a rediscovering of that collective interiority. What is it to inhabit a story, collectively with other persons and even in other places. But to all feel embedded, caught up inside a common flesh or a common story, a common imagination, a common awareness. And that's what I think Earth is calling us toward. If that makes some loopy sense. Yeah. Any other thoughts burgeoning forth? I'm very, very grateful for you folks letting me babble on with my bombast. And I just pray that, you know, some little flicker or thread of a thought might be useful to carry. How does it feel when we, you know, this whole identity politics thing? All right, it has its importance and its uses for sure, but as long as we don't let it occlude or eclipse identifying with oneself as an animal, identifying as one of the animals, as long as it doesn't get in the way of us identifying as pieces of earth, and along with all these other pieces of earth, or as Tani, I think, said so beautifully, that I'm a thing among things. Being a body is so rich.
You know, that was actually what I was going to say, something about otherness and othering. We hear so much about that these days. The other, right? Everything's, you know, the other has become anathema. And you talk so much about the other and otherness, and gee, it's a, you know, it's a good thing. We need others. We need another.
It's a great thing. It's, for me, and it comes from, it may partly be being Jewish, where alterity is a big deal. You know, someone like Emmanuel Levinas, very much of our tradition, speaking of the primacy of the ethical relation to the alterity of the other, or someone like Martin Buber, who we all know, speaking of the I and thou relation, also a great Jewish theologian. Something in Judaism puts a primacy on relationship, not on unity. And, you know, so somebody confronted Buber after the Second World War, you know, and saying, Martin, surely, you know, an educated man like you, today, you can't really believe in God. And Buber thought about it and said, you know, you're right. I don't believe in God, but I talk to him often. And it's that being in a rich participation with the otherness of things, or the otherness of the world, or the otherness of the divine, is very real to me. I can't do without otherness. And so it confounds me endlessly, Tani, when people speak of othering as a problem, or, oh, you know, you're seeing me as an other. I would hope I see you as as other than just me. But if I and that cottonwood tree, if I am the cottonwood tree and the cottonwood tree is me, then I can't. Then there's no eros. Then I can't fall in love with the cottonwood tree. I can't make love with the cottonwood tree because I already am it. And so, what fun is there in a world where it's all one?
Well, to the narcissist who wants to see himself in everything, you know, but I can't imagine anybody enjoys that. And anyway, it's a fiction. We're you know, there are differences between people, you know.
There are massive differences, but there is, you know, I mean, there's a healthy narcissism because there is something of you in each thing that you see, and that, you know, that's what enables that empathic leaning into. How do you reflect me back changed, altered, refracted, and I return to myself, but I've been changed by the encounter with this being who's kind of, you know, a little bit me, but is so massively not. So, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's really beautiful. Oh, Daniel.
Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, so interesting. So many thoughts. Um, Tying into what you were just talking about and something you said earlier about Earth having an I in it and this narcissism, you know, I've been thinking, can we really transcend a human-centered world without first transcending an ego-centered world? And, you know, since we are sort of talking about art, I wonder, can art have a role in the future in doing this? I really liked what you had to say about perspective being the mingling of the senses on the perceived, and how you bring that up most often as objects in the natural world, a raven, the mountain, or a spider. And these things really do that. But can art do that? The art world as it is now seems to amplify the ego. Can the art of the future act as this, have this role of shattering habitual ways of seeing?
I sure think it can. I'd be curious, and others take as well. I think, you know, linking to what you said about ego, similar to what we were just saying about otherness. Um, I don't have a giant problem with a sense of self or the I. I'm befuddled by even, you know, a good number of my Buddhist friends, and I actually Buddhism is one of the tools in my quiver, and I give talks, Dharma talks at the local Zendo and such. But when other sisters and brothers speak about, you know, just the importance of dissolving the self or dissolving the ego, I'm more, it seems to me, if we would just identify the self with the body, with that upright spine. I mean, think of the I as the upright spine. Think of the self as the body. Then it's already would then be so complexified, so and it's so manifold, including all of these other microbial forms of life that compose our organism, and the body is clearly utterly entangled with other bodies around it, including, as we were speaking of, the air that I need to breathe for my respiratory metabolism. But there'd be no air for me to breathe if all these plants weren't breathing out the oxygen that us animals need to breathe in. And we alchemize it within us, and then we breathe out the carbon dioxide that all the plants need for their metabolism. I mean, talk about reciprocity. So identifying with the body is already to begin to notice that one is dispersed, is multiple, and rides within oneself in various ways, but also rides out of oneself with every out-breath, with every instance of sight or of listening, that my body is so richly informed and entangled with everything else. I can't imagine what art might be if it's not the way of waking us up to that. Am I?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the art world, you know, and from the inside, it's a very different entity, and sometimes it seems like it's maybe going in the wrong direction. I mean, would you agree that we would need to transcend the ego in order to I mean, the way that you talk about a connectedness with nature, it seems like it's so wonderful. It's like, well, it seems like art should be able to do that.
But it does, brother. It does. I mean, I can't help but feel, and maybe when I'm speaking of just, I mean, maybe transcend the ego, but here I was saying, or just identify oneself as this animal flesh that you find accompanies your awareness wherever you go. Um, um, maybe that's analogous to also, as an artist, really paying keen and keener and keener attention to the materials of your medium, to the pigments of your paints. And where does this pigment come from? From what kind of stone or what kind of plant? At what point in its life cycle does this pigment arise? And this other pigment that I'm using in the same painting, these are different parts of earth joining up with one another. Or if I'm a composer, you know, it's just the materiality of the sounds, but of the instruments as well. The wood from which the violin is fashioned, and in what way is, you know, what I'm composing for violin giving fresh voice to those trees, to this tree that is embodied and incarnated in this violin and is now singing to us. So just, I'm wanting to deflect the problem of ego onto a sense of the weirdness of the material world and our own materiality and the way we echo one another and resonate with each other, so that even as you're speaking, or even as I'm speaking here, if you know, you don't follow what I'm saying, but you listen with your animal ears, you'll be hearing baraka daka chaka wa badala kadoodle way kadoodle wan kada kwe kwe, because our speaking is always first and foremost is just singing to one another, and my voice is rising and it's falling and it's got, you know, certain rhythm or a stutter. That's primarily all of the denotative meanings of our words ride on that material density and depth. And I wouldn't be able to communicate with you at all, Daniel, or any of you, or your words wouldn't communicate with me if they weren't also underneath all the denotative meanings, if you weren't singing to me and my body being moved and resonating with that song. And so that's what I mean about also taking care as we speak, not to use over much jargon, you know, but to be trying to always speak as bodies, as animals, fully embodied critters to other embodied animals. If that, yeah. Carrie, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I'm primarily an animal studies scholar, so of course I'm so thrilled to be hearing you in person. And I'm also have been a dancer and choreographer my whole life.
Wow.
I'm not quite performing anymore because of age. But I guess I just as a quick follow-up to Daniel's sort of point and sort of question, like, can we do this? I mean, one of the things I often talk about, I think I might have mentioned this way back at the symposium, so at the beginning, and I apologize if I'm repeating, but I often talk to my students about why dance is hardly ever mentioned, right? Sort of when people talk about the arts, and it's often sort of like the stepchild of the arts. And I think it's largely because it's a feminine, the body is the central mechanism, right? The body is the instrument, the body is the material. And of course, historically, that has been very feminized. And I've tried to suggest animalized, right? Like, we're afraid of bodies. We're not really comfortable with our bodies, right? And this has to do with everything that you've been talking about tonight, and kind of to Daniel's point, I think about sort of ego and likely, right, a kind of masculine, right, fear of, to Charlene's point, right, the body, the maternal body. So I guess it's not so much a question, it's just a, like, I really hope that you're right, and that we can find ways to embrace the body and the body's wisdom, and what I often talk about as embodied knowledges when I talk to my dance students. But sort of like Daniel, I do, I worry about it because I think that we're uncomfortable with bodies, right? We're more comfortable with abstraction, I think, at this stage in the West. So it's just kind of I guess just an acknowledgement and again, a kind of hopeful chorus with you that I hope we can be more animal, be more embodied. And I think that means, going way back to ecofeminism, of course, to be more feminine, right? And of course, that wonderful emphasis you have on relationality, that's been throughout your whole work, your body of work, and of course tonight. I just kind of want to like mark that as feminine, right? In a certain way. So that's really, there's an exuberant, I'm being really, I know I'm talking with my body now, but.
I hear you.
Yeah. So.
I want to say, yeah, we can mark it as feminine, and it surely is, but it's also, it waits to be really discovered, the male heart, and what's the masculine form of full-on relationality and exuberant animal dancing. I think the world is greatly in need of that now. Yes, I can't help but feel like an ecological crisis cascading around us on every hand in so many different styles and shapes. But at a primary motor of it that keeps it going is our abstractness and our increasing abstraction. We don't notice what is happening to other critters, what's happening to the land, to the woods, to the rivers, because we're now just caught up in the dazzle of the digital screen. We're increasingly cocooned in technologies that isolate our senses from the earthly sensuous. It's a terrible problem, and yet it's the work I suspect we're all called to do, even from within the technologies, but also beckoning outside of them, but drawing us back into our body and it's true with my work. People sometimes, I'll teach an extended workshop, and people will then step out into the world and they'll come running back and say, I'm not sure I want to be in my senses quite so much. I mean, there's so many wounds out here in the earth and so many gashes and losses. I'm just realizing. And so as the wounds intensify, there's ever more reason to take flight from the body's world and hide out in ever more fabricated and virtual spaces. But I think we have to lean hard against that in our own lives and in our craft, in our art, and in every aspect of our work. It came up in that last session, in this session with Charles. I am one who's been very struck by the fact that none of the indigenous communities, again, a tiny handful that I've had the luck to hang out in, had any word that could translate our word art. Not because there weren't artists, but because every participant in the community is engaged in what we would call art in several different media. But the idea that there would be a separate zone, a separated out zone of making for making things that were beautiful or aesthetic seems not to make sense in a culture where if anything you crafted, if a building, a house or a stool to sit on was not pleasing to the spirits, it would bring bad luck. And if the house was not what we would call beautiful, what they would often speak of as, being pleasing to the spirits or pleasing to the power of the place there, then that house is going to be riddled with insects, and ants will converge upon the house, or all sorts of problematic things will happen until you find a way to be honoring the spirits, who are often the ants and other creatures, but also the elemental powers of water and wind. So I wonder if art itself, at a certain point, might begin to fold back, if theater might begin to turn back into ritual, because we are so in need of rich, earthly, ceremonial craft and rituals that bind us and bind our senses back into the local earth and the seasons. We're so in need of, might, yeah, I mean, it seems to me every art, dance hugely, song immensely, opens and can become functional again, not in a narrow sense of functionality, but doing work, bringing the human community back into rich, like Murray Schafer's work as a composer. He was staging these big, ceremonial, ritualistic performances that really woke people up to the land there, and woke the land up to the people, or to the humans finally actually trying to relate to the rest of us, not just going and sitting inside concert halls. But I imagine that that's possible in every form of art, and whether at some point then even the word art might begin to dissolve back into just what we do in this culture, because the idea that we should have a realm of creation that's not artful, that's not richly beautiful, just using beauty, I mean, that doesn't speak to our sensate animal flesh, is very odd.
Well, we're up against a lot there in the art world, at least in the visual arts, but I'm optimistic. I think people are craving beauty, recovery of appreciation for beauty, certainly form, matter.
Yeah.
I mean, I really do. I think it's been a long time coming. I mean, we've had this, right, hegemony of concept for how many 50 or 12, well, I'd say like 40 years.
Yep.
All right. I think people are tired of it. They just really don't know how to break
It's
it.
exhausting, but it's exhausting to the animal body. But I got to say, it's exhausting to the earth. And so, yeah, whatever people are craving, the crisis is extreme and the hour is late.
Mhm.
And the more than human earth is desperately in need of us to be falling in love outward with everything else. And artists are the key most players in that.
And how none of us would ever utter the word love, right?
Right.
That's criminal. We're not allowed to talk about beauty. We're not allowed to talk about love, form. It's just crazy.
Gross, yeah.
Gross.
Lunatic. Hey, Charlene, I see you smiling there.
This has been wonderful.
Hmm.
What a way to end it, David. Really, this has just been incredible.
Hmm. Well, thanks. Thanks for the chance and the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. Hmm.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. I am going to post this. I just checked. It is recording. I'm going to post this later on this evening. And I know people are going to really enjoy watching this, and certainly other artists. But I suspect many more. So this will get out there. Thank you all for coming. And most of all, thanks to David. Really, it's just been incredible.
Thanks very much to you all.
Yep.
And thank you, Tanny, also. Just
Thanks.
we just have 10 seconds to also just say, wow, thank you so much for doing the work of bringing people together like this.
As I said in my mail, I could not be more happy with the way this has gone. So thank you all, really.
It's actually it's a delight and an honor to meet each of you, and Christine, to be introduced to your craft, your amazing work. Thank you very, very much. And the eloquence each of you shares in the blogs has been really like food for me. So thanks.
Christine has grown a tail.
I've been on mute this entire time. Speaking of being animal, this entire time would have been just insane had I not been muted. I apologize, but thank you so much. The spiral winds that have been introduced into my fingertips and then holding me to the air, just, I'm basically in the mud with all of this, just
Great.
enjoying, not, just being in sound and just this incredible recombination of material that for this time is the earth and everything on it. I do agree with you and look forward to what this means with art and its complete evolution here, for sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Mr. Sakata, would it be okay to, could I have a conversation with you sometime?
Absolutely. I look forward to that.
That'd be
Definitely.
great.
Great.
Good. Okay.
Looking forward to that.
Contact info from Tanny.
Great. Thank you.
And John is having a concert tomorrow, correct?
It's a virtual concert. That's what the world's come to, right? Talk about flattening the experience. But yes, my wife and I are playing a concert tomorrow down in Weston, down supposedly in Weston, Massachusetts, but we filmed it here in Exeter. So please, I think Tanny has the information.
Yeah, I'll be sending it out. Yep, either tonight or tomorrow morning. But yes, I will be there for sure. I'm sure many others will.
Great, thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right, so we'll wrap it up tomorrow. Hope to see you guys tomorrow on the blog. And all right, thank you, David.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Deborah.